If anything comes up, please make sure to just interrupt me. Don't hesitate. So because I can't see you when I teach on the PowerPoint, so I can see my whole PowerPoint, and that way you don't have to hands up. It's hard for me to see this. Just interrupt me. So that's different from this class to the regular classroom a little bit. So we were talking about last week we were talking about the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus with the primary motor and primary sensory areas. We were talking about all the lobes of the brain. And now we're getting into the hindbrain, into the cerebellum a little bit more. And the cerebellum is actually all the way. This is a pretty good picture of the brain. And then back here, this part here, that's the cerebellum part of the brain right in here. And the cerebellum is interesting because it is actually a small brain. It looks like a small brain, but it has so many small little nerve fibers, and they're very dense in there, that it has as many neurons as the cerebrum has, as the bigger portion of the brain here has. And so it is really involved in a lot of highly demanded functions of balancing with the movement apparatus a lot, but also with planning and adapting and so forth. And so it has a lot of, you can see how massive it is because the pons is right here in front of it, that bulge, and that accommodates all the tracks that go in and out of the cerebellum to then go up and down the spine and deliver, the spine delivers a lot of impulses of proprioception, of joint stretch, of giving the body the awareness where it is in space. And then also it goes up and down to the cerebrum. And that's a lot of tracks as well that coordinate function and movements with the higher order function. And then that, you know, what we traditionally call the balancing brain. So that's the cerebellum there. And then from the cerebellum, we go further down cerebellum here, we go into the midbrain area. And I usually don't use the midbrain as a structure to tag for a test. It's just, it's on the list, but it's more like an area that's like a little above the cerebellum. And then as we get to the front, above the pons. And in that area, what we're looking at are the structures that I'm really interested to look at are the inferior and the superior colliculi. And they're right here above the cerebellum in the back. And those have to do with reflex functions that react to stimuli, hearing stimuli and seeing things. So when we, for example, hear a fly or a little bug next to our ear, there's a tendency we want to look at it. Well, actually, there's a tendency we just want to be gone away, but you know, the brain wants to look at it, what we can hear in the periphery, so it can see it, and then it can react to it depending on what it is. And that's like, you know, if an airplane comes up or a car comes behind you, you reflexively look at it, and that reflex is executed in the inferior colliculus. And the superior colliculus has a similar reflex that reacts to visual stimuli in the periphery. So if you see something come in your peripheral field of your eyesight, then you look at it. So it's in the central field where you can see, you know, very clear and concise vision. So those are really cool structures, I think. So sometimes I like to tag those. And then I also want to talk about the thalamus. And the thalamus is right here. So when that's the next on the list, or one of the next on the list. The thalamus is part of the diencephalon, which is part of the sort of a little lower functioning than conscious level high functioning parts of the brain. So the thalamus is a place where all the sensory nerves that come into the brain are filtered through. And let me see, do I have a pathway of that? Yeah, I have a pathway of that. Let me see. Can you see that spinal cord thing here? Anybody?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. Yeah, just give me an auditory feedback. That would be great. Thanks. So the sensory impulse that we receive, like pressure or pain or temperature kind of impulses that goes into the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion, as we talked, I think we will talk today about that, into the posterior part of the spinal cord, and there it goes up onto the brain, and in the brain it makes a stop in the thalamus, and the thalamus then directs it to the different parts of the brain, so different regions. So depending on where you feel the temperature or the pain in your body, for example, that will then the thalamus will filter it out and say, oh, it's there, or it's there, it's there. So most of the incoming impulses that the body receives go through the thalamus. The exception is the sensory pathway of smell. That one goes straight to the limbic system and has to do with reaction to, that's from the lower level animals where we have to react to smell instincts, and that goes. The limbic system is the emotional brain, and so that's sometimes why smells can be reacting. The emotional brain can be, stimulated by smelling different things. Like poop versus rose bushes, kind of different things. So then from there we go to the structure that's actually right inferior to the thalamus, the thalami, and that's the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a lot of these different nuclei, these nerve cell body centers that do a lot of things. But the thing that I find most fascinating with them is the connection, the link that it creates between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the feeling or thinking and reacting to what happens long term in the body function. So this is where we have the link between mind and body that we can create. And so the hypothalamus is really a fascinating structure because of that. And you can see all these different nuclei. That's why I put this up, because it's really cool to see all these different little clusters. Some of them have, of course they all have names, but I'm not going to worry about, I just let the arcuate nucleus is here because it's already arch, and of course they all have different functional attributes. What I also have on the brain structures is the pituitary gland, because we learned that in the endocrine system that's straight related to the hypothalamus, and as the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland which hormones to secrete into the bloodstream that then do things like growth or thyroid, figure out the metabolism in the body, etc., etc. And from there, we can go into, as the hypothalamus is sort of in the front, this is the thalamus. In the back, we have the epithalamus, which is partly the pineal gland, which we talked about as a gland structure. But the other thing that we have there is this red stuff that we can see here, and that's the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is what secretes cerebrospinal fluid into these spaces that are carved out in the brain as spaces, and are filled with fluid that nourishes the brain and gives it buoyancy also, because that's the same fluid that goes around the brain and creates that film of liquid as a cushioning device. So the brain can effectively lose 97% of its weight under gravity, which is very important because you don't want a brain to be collapsed. It's a very sensitive and soft structure, because think about it, if you study and you go like, God, I can't, study this, and then you study hard and it hurts a little bit in the head, and then you actually know something more later, that's painful process, a little bit painful, but in some ways also exciting, because that really shows you where neurons grow through the brain. I mean, I remember I was up at this guy working on his thigh muscles, a football player, and he and one day, and I was working for a lot. I was learning a new technique, and then I went home and studied the adductor muscles really in detail, all the attachments exactly with the bones next to me, and and then the next day I went back, and he said, "Oh my God," he felt such a difference in my approach. That was one study, because one day I just took that time and went straight as much as I can into that material and grew these neurons as well as possible. And so it was interesting to feel that, it's you guys feel it all the time as students, it's often not so rewarding because it's hard work to study. So then the spaces that are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid are outlined right here, and they're also on your term list. And so they're the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle in between the thalami, and then the fourth ventricle in front of the cerebellum, and connecting them is the cerebral aqueduct. And so I want to, after we go through the things on the PowerPoint, I want to show you those structures that are on the term list on the model that I use for the test. And I'm still working on making a PDF version of all those pictures. And so then you can download it and study from those. So what else is there for the brain? We have the pons. We talked briefly about the pons. The pons is this swelling here in front. Here is probably, no, it's not indicated there. Here it is. You can see this is the pons, and you can see it closer up right here. There's the word pons. And so that's that place where we have a lot of connections going to the cerebellum and back. And below that is the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata has has a few structures on it. It has that we are interested in. It has, it harbors fundamental reflex activity like respiration stuff and cardiovascular stuff, but it also has things like the olivary nucleus, the olive in there that work with joint and muscle stretches and then relay that information to the cerebellum, so the cerebellum can react to, like, when you let's say you walk somewhere and there is a divot in the street and you didn't see it and you kind of almost fall, but you don't fall. That's all cerebellum, that balancing out act. And that's in the olivary nucleus. And actually, what the other structure that I outlined in the medulla oblongata is the pyramids. And then the next thing that I don't outline, but it's important, is the decussation. And so the pyramids are actually the nerves that send signals down from the primary motor area. So this is the area, this is the area, and you can see the how much space is given to which part of the body, which body parts. This is the area that executes motor function. And so from here, the nerve will travel down through the medulla oblongata, through the pyramids in the medulla oblongata, and then cross over in the decussation of the medulla oblongata and feed into a muscle on the opposite side of the body. And this pathway, as we get into the spinal cord, this pathway is a two-order pathway. You have a higher order neuron that goes from the brain out here all the way down to the level of the spinal cord where the nerve needs to come out to feed the muscle. And there you have a synapse, and you have a second nerve, a secondary neuron, they call that then, that goes from that level of the spinal cord to the muscle. And what's interesting, so that's how that pathway is. And so that's how these pyramids, and the word pyramid comes from the fact that the cell bodies, not anything pyramidal here, but the cell bodies look like upside down pyramids in the precentral gyrus. And so when they look in the microscope, they go like, oh, look at that. They look like upside down pyramids. Then they call all these pathways pyramidal things. And then we go like, why would they use that name? It's like one of those weird ones. But it's cool once we know about it a little bit. So, and the decussation is cool because that is the place where you know that the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain. And it's the same for sensory as it is for motor. And the structure that we didn't talk about is the basal ganglion. And I want to briefly mention that because as we tell the body to move, and let's say we want to turn on a light switch, you have to get up and move, the precentral gyrus, that motor command center that sends a nerve down to the muscle that makes us move, shoots out an impulse, and then the basal ganglion, that nerve says, hey, we got to move these leg muscles in order to get up and get, the light switch on. And then the basal ganglion is where we have stored motor patterns. And then those, for example, then when we walk, all of a sudden the basal ganglion says like, oh, that's walking. I know how walking goes. And it takes over and it does this rhythmic thing and this rhythmic motion pattern of walking. And this is actually a place where we have these learned movement patterns, like when we play a piano or we drive a car. And this is where the thing, when we say practice makes perfect, doesn't actually work, because practice makes permanent. Because the motion patterns of playing a guitar or driving a car can be also wrongly stored in the system. So that's why there is an importance to learning something right the first time, so you don't have to relearn it the whole time. So there's an argument that would speak for that. So that's kind of interesting. So the motor pathways are influenced by the basal ganglion, and then as we go deeper down into the brain, we bypass the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is where we have the balancing control. And so let's say we walk to the light switch and we have a little hole in the floor and we don't see it and we almost stumble into it. That will be a balancing that the cerebellum will then take over that motion pattern pathway and balance it out, that we don't fall down, and help the muscles contract in a fashion that we don't fall. And so that's pretty cool, impressive to me. And it's a lot what goes on in the brain and in the spinal cord. Because as we get into the spinal cord, a lot of pathways, these are the pathways. These blue ones are sensory and these red ones are motor. These are the pathways that go up and down the spinal cord, and a lot of them are used for musculoskeletal functions. And so you can see the naming here. The naming is interesting when you look at these tracks. I'm not going to go through them for the test. They're not on the test, but conceptually speaking, like these here, the red ones are motor tracks. So these are tracks that go from, these are the pyramidal tracks, what we were just talking about. They go here, and the cervicals are here, the thoracics are here, lumbars are here, etc. And then in the front, they are also here in these red ones. So the red ones are motor tracks. Tracks that go down from the brain out to the periphery. And they are named by from where they come to where they go. So corticospinal, then the beginning point is the cortex, the end point is the spine. And so that's the piece I want you to know from this slide, as like how you can memorize these damn things later on in a deeper class if you take a deeper class. Or spinal cerebellum cerebellar is a tract that sends stretch, nerve and muscle stretch, tendon and ligament and muscle stretch, joint stretch to the cerebellum from the spine. So it's spinal cerebellum. It starts in the spine and goes to the cerebellum. That's a blue. That's a sensory tract going upward. And so that's how that is sort of organized in terms of the white stuff, the tract part. And then in the spinal cord, we also have a gray part, a gray matter part, and that's cell bodies. Whatever is grayish or darker is cell bodies. Whatever is whiter has myelin sheaths. These are these lipid sheath around the axons, these nerve fibers, and that appears white. And so these colored things here, in actuality, are more like these white things here. But let me go to a spinal cord on the inside here. Where are we? There we go. So we have in the brain, we have the white matter on the inside and the gray matter on the outside, because again, the gray matter is new cell bodies and the white executive centers and decision-making integration centers, and the white matter is axons, and the myelin, the fatty part, shows up on the axons. And so these tracts are on the outside in the spinal cord. On the inside, we got the gray matter. To start with, there a couple of places on the list is the central canal that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And the in the front side, we have the anterior groove, or they also call it the ventral medial fissure or anterior fissure. So there's multiple different names for it, but that's the deep groove on the front side of the spinal cord. And on the back side, we have a little shallow groove. So that's a sulcus or a septum, posterior median septum, or posterior median sulcus, depending on which textbook you use. And then as we get to the inside of the spinal cord, we have the different areas of gray matter. But let me actually back up and go briefly to this structure here, because what you want to do here, you want to be able to orient yourself what's front, what's back. And why that matters in the spinal cord is the fact that the back side of the part of the spinal cord is filled with sensory stuff, so information going into the central nervous system, and the front side is concerning itself with information going out of the spinal cord. So that's motor information. And so what then is necessary to visualize is this bulge here, this ganglion. So that's the dorsal root ganglion. What that is a cluster of cell bodies of all the sensory nerves that come in at that level. And so these cell bodies are very smart. There's a long thing from the receptor at the periphery, whatever that is. Maybe that's a pain receptor or a nerve, thermal receptor. So that sends the signal into the spinal cord. The cell body of that nerve is located right in here, because we don't want cell bodies in an exposed area where they can be crushed. And so here they are nicely protected in a group of all the other ones too. And so they're sitting in the dorsal root ganglion. So this swelling that gets created by that tells you that this side of the cord is the posterior side, or the dorsal side, as we often use in the older language. And that's where we have sensory information coming in. And so when we look at the gray matter, this is the part also that then is the dorsal or posterior horn, and it harbors the sensory nuclei. And then in the front, as an opposite, we have the motor. We have the stuff going out. So we have motor nuclei here, somatic motor nuclei that go out into the periphery, arms and legs and muscles of all kinds. And that is the place where we have the ventral horn. And then when you look on the list, we have one more horn, and that's the lateral horn. And the lateral horn is associated itself with autonomic motor nerve nuclei. And so autonomic is functions like the adrenaline thing, like the sympathetic function of fight and flight reactions, or the rest and digest, the parasympathetic functions. That's in the autonomic nuclei, organized in terms of reflex nuclei that we have in here. Good. So that's good for that part. And then we go, when we look at the list, what we need to look at, and I'm not making you, study these different tracts and all that, because that's just a lot of linguistics, that language stuff that gets too cumbersome for everybody. This is stuff that you should look up if you need to look it up. If you conceptually understand it, then that's much more important, I think. But if we orient ourselves, here we got the dorsal root ganglion. You can see here is the cell body, that round little dot, and it brings the information in to the spinal cord, and then the dorsal horn where it feeds it into. And then on the front side, we have the ventral, the anterior horn, and it gets the information out to the effector organs. The back side here where the dorsal root ganglion is, that's known as the dorsal root. And so the dorsal root, is always a sensory nerve. The ventral root is on the other side, that sends information out. That's always a motor nerve. And then when they come together, as they exit the spinal cord, they become the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve because it has both sensory and motor information in it. And then most nerves in the periphery are mixed nerves, but not all are mixed. Some of them are just simply motor or simply sensory. Like you think of the nerve that sees, the optic nerve, that's a purely sensory nerve. bringing information from the brain part, the head, but it's still cranial nerves or spinal nerves that come out of the brain. So it is a spinal nerve, it is a peripheral nerve from that perspective speaking. So it carries, but that's one that carries only sensory information. Most peripheral nerves carry mixed, both motor and sensory. And then on this slide, we can pull it a little further out. So we have the roots here. We have the DRG. So that's the dorsal, ventral, spinal nerve. And then you have an offshoot that goes right off, a small one, that goes to the posterior part of the body. And we call that the posterior rami. And the one that then goes around, that's much thicker, is the anterior rami, because the posterior rami just feeds the back part of the back, and the anterior feeds all the internal organs and all that stuff. So that's kind of for that, what I wanted to talk about. I think that's pretty good. And then let's look at the spine from the side. When we look at the spine from the side, we see it gets a little thicker here, and then it gets a little thicker here in the lumbar region. So cervical region, lumbar region, the enlargements, these are called cervical and lumbar enlargements, and they help accommodate the increased nerve supply that goes on in the upper and in the lower extremities. Just think of how many more pathways need to happen just because we got reflexes going on, things that go right to the cord, in and out, and there's just so much more happening there. Oh, this is actually a pretty view of the motor cortex primary and the primary sensory cortex, info going down and info coming up. I like this slide here. And then on the next one, we have the spinal cord comes to a tip at about L1, L2 bone level measured. And the fact why it doesn't go further down is that the nervous system doesn't grow as much as the skeletal system when we grow up. And so that tip, as the spinal cord comes to a close, that's called the conus medullaris. And from there, we have spinal nerves, basically, that go down and exit the proper placing in the holes in the bones that they're meant for that. And they create sort of a horsetail looking thing. And they call that the horse's tail, the cauda equina. That's what that means. And you have a thin filament that's the skin that's right over the brain and over the spinal cord is called the pia mater. That's in part of the meninges of the brain, the protection layers. And that pia mater that's around the spinal cord comes together and anchors the cord into the coccyx here. So it doesn't swing around and it's just free floating and loosey-goosey. So that's what it's not indicated here because you can't really see it. So it's on the list, but it's not really a structure that I can pull off and show you. When I do these tests, I want to be very showy and not hidden and weird. I want to try to take away the guess game as much as I can have it. And with that said, let me actually show you. Oh, look, this is next week. Show you on the brain structures, some structure, at least show you the brain, the model that I use for the test. And I still have to work on a list on a document, the PDF document with all those pictures on it. I'll do that tomorrow morning, and then I'll upload it so you guys can download that and study from those pictures that are actually the ones used on the test. And so if I get to the brain there, I have a right hemisphere, a left hemisphere, and I have a longitudinal fissure between the two hemispheres. We can't really see that here. No, definitely not here. But you see on this picture, maybe if you visualize, you have this right hemisphere, then here's the left hemisphere, you put them together. And then there is a deep groove that goes all the way in between, all the way down to this white structure, this grayish structure. And that's the longitudinal fissure. And this grayish structure is actually the corpus callosum. That's one term on your list. These are the connections from left to right hemisphere that go across. So these are pretty cool there. And then from there, we go right into identifying lobes. And if we look at this part of the brain here, identifying lobes, we have a frontal lobe that's in front where the frontal bone is. We have a parietal lobe that's on the side where the parietal lobe bone is. We have an occipital lobe that's underneath the occipital bone, and then we have a temporal lobe, and that's underneath the temporal bone. We also have the precentral gyrus that's sort of reddish here, and we have the postcentral gyrus that's sort of bluish here. So these are these two motor and sensory primary areas on the cortex that we've been kind of talking about a little bit. Oh, I didn't show you that the motor pathway we saw was 2 neurons. The sensory pathway is a 3rd neuron because the sensory has to go through the thalamus, which we can go right next to it. The thalamus, and the thalamus is right here. So as the nerve information comes up in sensation, we have a synapse, a change from one to the next neuron in the thalamus, because it's in there where there's the organization where the different information goes to in the cortex than in the brain. So that's the thalamus. So that's good to know as a structure. And then this is the hypothalamus right here, and this is the pituitary gland right here. Then here we have the midbrain, and on the midbrain, what I really worry about is not the area, it's these 2 points. And these 2 points are right above the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. And these are the inferior colliculus and the superior colliculus. Or colliculi, inferior and superior. And then here in the front is the pons. And that's, you can see this route bridging here. That's the pons. And then what else we have on there is the olive, which is a little hard to see here. There's the olive. And then on the front here, I have a front. Do I have the front here a little bit? On the front here, those cells that will be going up and down here are the pyramidal cells. So these will be the pyramidal tract. So that's this number 126. But don't go by numbers because all these brains have different numbers. But if I use it on a test, it's one where you can see lines going up and down. Anywho, that's that one. Olive, we have thalamus, hypothalamus. And then I think the last one that we want to go here is the model here. And this is the ventricle. So this is actually a model made out of the space that is in the brain. I should have pointed it out here. If you see here, you go like, this doesn't fit. I mean, that's when I first saw it. I'm like, this doesn't fit. What's wrong with this thing? And of course, the space is supposed to be there. And in this space is where we have the cerebrospinal fluid. And this red stuff is indicating what secretes it. This is the choroid plexus here. And so then that fluid circulates around in these ventricles. And we have these lateral ventricles here on both sides. And then the 3rd in between, and the 4th in front of the cerebellum. And that stalk in between the 3rd and the 4th is the cerebral aqueduct. So that's the brain. And then the spinal cord, I have a few things on the cord. I don't have the frontal section where I have to find a picture of that I could show, put on that PDF. When I did these pictures, it was just the beginning of COVID. So I sort of did them on a flash, so I forgot a few things. But on this one, you could see this is embedded in the cervical vertebra. This is the cord. So this is the back part. And you also can orient yourself. Well, you can see this is the spinous process. That's how you can orient yourself. But you can also look at this bulge, and that's the dorsal root ganglion. And that is the place where the nerve cell bodies are for the nerves that feed information in, the sensory nerves. And they go from the back. So this is the posterior roots. And then they go into the posterior horn, and that's right here. The lateral horn is right here, and the anterior horn is right here. And then from the anterior horn, we have the motor nerve fibers come out, and they don't have a bulge, so they are motor, and they're in the front, anterior. What else we have on that? I think that's pretty much it. This is the central canal right in here. This is the anterior groove right here in the front. So this is the posterior sulcus, posterior median septum, sorry about that, or sulcus. And I think that's all I have on the showcase for this. And so what I would like to do is I would like to, do you guys have any questions to that, or is that pretty clear?
Pretty clear.
Pretty okay, good. So why don't we then take a sheet of paper and do a practice quiz with some of these terminologies, and we'll start with the spinal cord. And that gets you sort of more oriented on the list a little bit and gets us also towards, you know, learning these terms for the final exam. All right, so take a sheet of paper if you could, please. And I want you to tell me as number one, or I want you to write down. Don't tell me yet. Tell me afterwards. I want you to write down what we just went through. Is this one structure right here? Is one that I like you to tell me what it is. This brownish structure filled with cell bodies that brings information in from the backside, here from the sensory side. And then I want you as number two, tell me what is this bulge, this yellow bulge that is a good landmark to use to understand that these nerves come in and are sensory nerves. What is this bulge called? Number two. And then from there, I want to go right into, now we did all of that, huh? Into this picture that we used for showing the spaces. And so I want you to tell me, what are these big, long ones called? These biggest ones on both sides. There's one on both sides. What do we call those? And then we go to number four. And number four, I would like you to tell me on the brain, what is this back brain called? This cauliflower back brain. That is number four. And we can stay right on here for number five. And number five, I'd like you to tell me this structure here. This is where all the, or practically all the sensory information has to relay and then go from there, be directed to the different parts of the brain. What is this structure called? Number five. And number six is a favorite of mine. Is this structure here that is the connections between right and left hemisphere. So these connections go in and out of here from hemisphere to hemisphere, and it's all the way around here. It's a pretty big, thick structure. That's number six. That's the one I say women have a much better development, and that's why the guys can't only do one thing at a time and can multitask. But who knows if that's really true. Number seven is the lobe on the brain that's in the back. The backmost lobe is number seven. And then number eight, I want you to tell me what this lobe here is. Yeah, the one on the side behind the ears is number eight. And then number nine, I'd like you to tell me the name of this wiggle here, this red wiggle here. That's the one that's attached to the frontal lobe. What is this one? Number nine. And then number 10, let's make sure we've asked some difficult ones too, so we don't get too lax. What's this thing here called? This is the hidden lobe, this little island lobe here that's behind the other one. That's behind the ear one. Good, that's number 10, and that's good enough. So let's go backwards with the solving of this quiz. I want to hear as many voices as I can, please. Yelling at me. What's number 10?
Insula?
There you go, insula, very good. So that's that island lobe. So if I show it, I can only really see it here on this on this model brain. So that's why I want to outline it already in a quiz. So we go through it a few times. And then number 9, right here.
Precentral cortex?
Yes, precentral, or actually it's the precentral gyrus where it's laying at, but I will take precentral cortex too. That's the functional component of it. It's the primary motor cortex. Excellent answer. Number 8, lobe behind the ear.
Temporal bone. Lobe.
Temporal lobe, right? Yeah, temporal lobe. And then the one in the back. Number 7.
Occipital lobe.
Occipital lobe, very good. Very good. And then we go to the side cut of the brain here. And I ask for this structure as in number 6.
Corpus callosum?
Corpus callosum, very good. That's one of my favorites. If I say that, you probably want to star it for the test. I think I go with gut feelings on these things. And then this structure here in the middle.
Thalamus?
Thalamus, very good. That's number 5. Thalamus, very important structure. And then the hindbrain here, the small one, the cauliflower brain. 4.
Cerebellum.
Cerebellum.
Cerebellum, very good. And last but not least, oh, we did this here. These structures here, number 3.
Lateral ventricle?
Lateral.
Yes, lateral ventricles, very good. And then we get to the spinal cord to finish it up with this yellow balls here, number 2.
Ganglia?
Ganglion.
Yes, dorsal root ganglia. So it's actually, you know, the name is DRG, and I take that name when it's a written test. But it's, you know, the dorsal is this dorsal part, the root is, this is the root, and ganglia means a cluster of cell bodies in the periphery. So that's the naming. And then the last question here is this number 1.
Posterior horn.
Posterior horn, very well, super, excellent. That's exactly right. All right, so that's pretty good. So let's see. Do you guys have any questions, or is that pretty good? No comments? Good. Well, no questions. That's good too. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I'm just trying to piece together like what each part of the brain does.
Oh, I know. Mm-hmm.
It's so like interconnected, but each part has its own. Anyways, just trying to figure out how it all pieces together. So it's not really a question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point because it is really hard and it's really complicated. And I kind of try to piece it together in my course as much story as I can muster and figure out. That's why it's like, you know, the curricula have this function you can describe. So that's kind of cool because you have something tangible. It's not just intangible stuff. Or I like the way that the motor pathways get influenced by the basal ganglia as in rhythmic motions, or, you know, learn patterns like playing the piano or violin, or, you know, and why it is so important, for example, to learn something right, and then how the cerebellum influences those motions. And then things come up too, like, for example, we know now more that the cerebellum is also part of the planning for bigger things, not just execution of motions, but it's also adjusts and adapts planning patterns that we have to adjust to the environment and so forth. So it's kind of, you know, a lot of it is not set in stone either. So it's sort of interesting from that. So it's kind of like we just have to sort of take that as the foundation that it's sort of not, we're not able to explain it like it's a heart. But then what all the pieces are and all the little stories, we bring them together and hopefully create a picture that makes us understand it better. You know, that like that's why I put neuroplasticity things in there, like, you know, the pathways that we use, the neural that fires together will wire together, and sort of these places where knowing about the neurology fits into psychology a little bit too.
Yeah, no, today was helpful to kind of like get some more information about all these parts, because it can be abstract, but it was helpful. Yeah.
Oh, good. No, I'm glad, because I'm always sort of thinking, you know, when I'm just talking into the computer screen, and if you have a class looking at you, it's a little different, but it's not necessarily better or not, because we also can go into some detail if I'm at least cohesive the way I talk about it. But it is really, really complicated. And I would think, you know, I understand a fraction of what is really going on. You know, I think we have to keep that in mind. Yeah, it's very complicated, and a lot of stuff we just don't know. You know.
Yeah. So yeah, and also I'm sure that your tests like review page has more about what you are looking for, also like what we need to know as well. But,
oh yeah. Well, no, in terms of the brain itself, you really need to be able to label the structures.
Structures. Okay.
You know, that's then the term list basically. And for the review sheet for the more written part, the multiple choice true false part of the test, I more have the fundamentals, the nerve impulse, the mechanism of the action potential, for example, is on that. Or, you know, what are the brain and spinal cord or central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. And so a few of those data points that you will find there on page 2 and page 3, I think. And then when we get next week to the sensory organs, there's a few information points there, like, you know, how does the eyeball see kind of things, or how do we hear? What's actually the process of hearing? A few things that describe the physiology of the thing. Some of these receptors are fascinating. Next week is kind of cool. I really like that sensory chapter.
Awesome.
That becomes a little bit more, you know, like wowing, because like when you hear, you basically bend hair, and that's how you hear. You know, that's like, wow, that's really cool.
Wow.
Yeah. Anywho, so yeah, brain's always a challenge, but it's cool stuff. It's really cool stuff.
Definitely.
And gathering the much information you can around it. But I think, you know, again, as applied as possible too, you know, and that's why the neuroplasticity, or do the gratitude journal for a week that we have there in the health kit. That's, I think, is very interesting. There's a TED talk in the back of the booklet that says, want to be happy, be grateful. That's the last column in the middle. That's a really cool one to watch, on sort of what does this mean to me kind of question. You know, that's always important.
Yeah, a gratitude journal is really great. I like that one. Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
You know, and it can be just in the day book or whatever, but it's great to reflect on these positive things.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All right. I think from that, I think you guys do fantastic. So keep up the studying. And I wanted to take some roll. I have Alexis. I have Manfred is here. I have Koa. I have Kayla May. I have Vannery. I have Caitlin. I have Veronice. I have Abril.
Yeah.
I have Danoit. Jamuna.
Yes.
And we just talked, Sarah. And then Brianna. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate your company this evening. And I think we can close out a little bit early unless somebody has another question. If not, thank you for participating and have a wonderful week.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.